Welcome to all of our participants. Today, I am Terry Shoemaker. I am a lecturer in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University, and we're excited to have you participate today in our faculty forum. And we're excited to have our guest speaker today, Sarah Riccardi-Swartz. Right before I introduce Sarah, let me just lay out the agenda for today. So I'm going to introduce Sarah. She's going to make a presentation for us. And if at any point, and we actually encourage this, any of our participants, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can after Sarah's presentation. And so with that, today we're very fortunate to have Sarah Riccardi-Swartz, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Recovering Truth Project at the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University, an anthropologist, scholar of American religion, and trained documentary filmmaker. She specializes in social politics, media, and Orthodox Christianity. Her first book manuscript, which is based on her award-winning dissertation, is titled Political Apostasy: American Conversions to Russian Orthodoxy During the Trump-Putin Era. The book builds on her doctoral research to highlight how converts to the Russian Orthodox Church in the United States are enmeshed in expanding global ideological networks of nationalistic theological conservatism found in mass and digital media worlds. The research was funded by several groups, including New York University, the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, the Louisville Institute, Charlotte W. Newcomb Fellowship, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Fordham University, and a Religion, Spirituality, and Democratic Renewal Fellowship from the Social Science Research Council. And with that introduction, I am going to mute myself and turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Terry. And thank you so much to everyone who made this possible and made the reschedule from the horrific ice storm where I'm living last month. So thank you to all who are tuning in, who wanted to tune in last month. I'm grateful to be able to talk with you all this afternoon. I'm going to do what anthropologists do best and tell you some stories and talk about how these stories fit into the global context of conspiracy theories. One muggy afternoon in the summer of 2018, I sat in a small monastery office in the mountains of West Virginia with a young American monk, a former Protestant, and a convert to Russian Orthodoxy. As he told me about his conversion experience, his life before vowed monasticism, and why he was devoted to the Russian Orthodox Church, he proclaimed without hesitation and with great insistence that, quote, only Russia can save the world. He went on to provide ideological rationales for his comment, focused on fears of LGBTQ plus acceptance, moral concerns over the so-called rise of the transgender movement, and what he saw as the corrosive culture of individualism and secularism corrupting godly America and the West. Now, at first, his comments didn't register as part of the language of conspiracism. Certainly, his words were entangled with the language of American Christian conservatism, reminiscent of persecution panic and notions of marginalization that have become popular in evangelical and even Catholic social narratives about the relationship between church and state. His comments also registered as a form of radicalized far-right political rhetoric that has become globally focused in this new Cold War period of tension between Russia and the United States. Yet as I analyzed this monk's comments alongside the other interviews from my year of fieldwork with his far-right community of converts to Russian Orthodoxy, I began to see how their ideas, their interest in Russia, namely the Russian Orthodox Church and its intimate political allies at the Kremlin, were potentially linked to larger circulations of conspiratorial thought in parts of Orthodoxy in the late 2010s. Now, in the time I have today with you, I want to draw our attention to some examples of globalized conspiracism seemingly present in the communities with whom I work. I want to emphasize that my research focuses on a specific segment within the Orthodox population, which means that it's not homogeneous in their political affiliations. This Appalachian community and others like it throughout the United States is a minority group in the West. but it is a satellite of the larger Russian Orthodox body of roughly 100 million believers. In the US, Russian Orthodoxy's social ethos is swiftly transforming because of the influx of former evangelical converts who often promote conspiratorial ideas that could be categorized as fascist. Ideas about globalism, child trafficking, and the Hollywood Washington, D.C. cabal links, the deep state, COVID-19 as a hoax or an extinction event, and 2020 presidential election fraud are among the many conspiracies swirling through the social media worlds of far right Orthodox Christians in the US. And this content is often drawn from media outlets in Russia. I'm not so much interested in conspiracy theories about Trump himself. Rather, I want us to think about the ways in which conspiracies are mobilized within connective, often digital ideological imaginaries that are globally situated. I suggest, as many scholars have, that often conspiracies have the potential to become the social language of fascism, thereby creating potent threats to democracy. And I also want to push us to think a bit about what this might mean for the American body politic. When some types of conspiratorial world building projects reject democracy and turn to the faith and politics of a foreign power in favor of a new ideological vision of reality. In terms of politics, how would you describe yourself? I asked Gwen, a young cradle Orthodox believer living in the Appalachian convert community where I worked. I'm a fascist, she replied readily. And then she followed up saying, I'm trad, traditional. With her short response, Gwen, who was a regular member of this large and growing ultra conservative community of converts, brought to the fore an aspect of right wing ideologies that has been increasing, or at least much more public, since 2016. Fascism as a world making project that exudes mobilizing ideologies such as nostalgia for nationalism and traditionalism. In Gwen's community, traditionalism was often a gloss for moral purity, homophobia, transphobia, and anti immigration sentiment that sustained their worldviews in opposition to secularism. Appalachian converts and others like them throughout the rural Midwest and American South employ world building language that is often fascist in nature. Heterodox versus orthodox, Marxist versus Christian, gay versus straight, corrupt versus holy. Fascism needs a language, propaganda, conspiracy theories, theology. Through such discourses, fascism and its political affiliates give shape to social realities, to new ideological worlds. Gwyn was a trad fascist, self proclaimed, and she lived in a community where people identified by a variety of political affiliations that would fall under the umbrella of the alt right: paleoconservative, monarchist, czarist, far right, nationalist. These were all self identified labels that many converts provided. The parish Gwyn attended was part of a socially insular group founded in the early 2000s by converts. It was attached to a men's monastery that moved to the region because of an irresistible land offer. Along the way, locals and converts from the South and Midwest arrived to join either the monastery or the parish. While most non monastic parishioners held jobs, raised families, and contributed to their local economies, they were nevertheless caught up in the cycles of liturgical time and the remapping of Russian Orthodox values onto America in hopes of making it traditional again. This was the status quo of the community. And to be sure, there were far more radical outliers, and also a small minority who didn't see Russia as the new arbiter of morality. For Gwyn, being trad meant marrying young, focusing on family life and domesticity, preserving the patriarchy both socially and religiously, and following a monarchic political leader who would actively promote a Christian social agenda nationally. In essence, Gwyn and her Orthodox compatriots were seeking a sovereign for the end of the world. Various converts in my field site praised Putin, wished for him to be crowned the next Tsar of Russia, and questioned which side they would fight for, the Americans or the Russians, if we found ourselves embroiled in a third world war. But that's not the most interesting or important part of this community. While these converts, many of them former evangelicals, evoked moral language reminiscent of that found in their former spiritual homes, they were and are a minority religious group. They don't wield the same political force as their former evangelical counterparts. Yet they're part of something that is potentially far more globally entangled than the American evangelical establishment. They're a node in the rapidly spreading networks, both digital and on the ground, of radicalism that includes a wide variety of ideological positionalities that are often anti American government in nature. And this is something we saw on full display at the Capitol siege with other outright violent far right groups that ran the gamut from the Proud Boys to the Three Percenters and beyond. The siege was driven by conspiracy theories, mostly founded in QAnon ideologies, fueled, it seems, by Trump and other members of his political team, and acted out by individuals united in the belief that the true outcome of the election had been taken from them. The siege was a public display of some of the groups that are part of the growing radical networks of conservatism, perhaps even fascism, that exist in the United States today, and are quickly becoming a threat to national security, as the FBI and other government organizations have repeatedly told us in the past 2 years. While extremists at the Capitol were seemingly of the same mind that something conspiratorial was afoot with the election outcome, they were also united by the perennial principles of fascist behavior that philosopher Jason Stanley reminds us of in his excellent primer, How Fascism Works. The contemporary logics of fascism are not the same as they were in the 20th century, yet it still employs many of the same tropes wherever we find it fomenting: us versus them, nostalgia for a past that never was, the ready use of propaganda steeped in anti intellectualism and anti science rhetoric, the creating of a new reality, a new world, through conspiracy. All of these are the hallmarks of fascism, and all of these can be found, in varying degrees, in many far right Orthodox circles, particularly online. Stanley has pointed out that part of creating this new reality, or what I, as an anthropologist, would call a world building project, is categorizing who has worth or value, thereby pushing those who don't fit into the mold to the periphery. This is undoubtedly seen in the existential threat that many of those on the far right believe outsiders pose not only to the nation, but to the family structure. Immigrants are often cast as unlawful and unwelcome harbingers of an alien future in the social drama of fascism. Anything beyond the heteronormative familial structure creates what Stanley calls sexual anxiety: fear of the unknown, fear of the future, fear of the other. Fear is the powerful emotional force that helps give fascism its horrific shape. And fear is what conspiracy theories and conspiracism more broadly often incite. These fears are expressed differently depending on what type of conspiracy paradigm is employed to create social solidarity. Within the past 4 years, but particularly since 2020, it seems as if new conspiracism, conspiracy theories reinforced by group repetition without some sort of supportive theoretical scaffolding, as political scientists Nancy Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead argue, has become not only the language of the far right and of fascists, but the weapon through which they want to seemingly upend American liberal democracy. Classical conspiracism, on the other hand, has some sort of internal logics, a theoretical base that will keep it consistent, somewhat plausible, and tied to the political. So let me give you an example of this from my recent research. In January 2021, political pundit and conservative writer and journalist Rod Dreher gave the 38th annual Alexander Schmemann Lecture at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary, a historic educational institution for Orthodox Christians in the US, and one of the largest producers of English language Orthodox publications. This lecture series honors one of the 20th century's theological luminaries and ecumenical forces in Western Orthodox Christianity. Dreher, a convert to Orthodox Christianity, is not a theologian. His selection as the speaker for this important event in American Orthodox circles received a good deal of pushback, especially given his politics, particularly those found in his most recent book, Live Not by Lies: A Manual for Christian Dissidents. Dreher's book, which he's promoted in far-right media circles, including on the Eric Metaxas show, suggests that the erasure of Christianity in the US is a result of liberal authoritarianism. He says all of this is on the horizon. Through conversations with former dissidents from Soviet socialism, Dreher draws out the terrors of moral oppression, deep state surveillance, and suggests that American believers will ultimately face a progressive regime of persecution that potentially ends in soft-style gulags. Indeed, he argues, and I'm going to quote him here, "The parallels between a declining United States and a pre-revolutionary Russia are not exact, but they're unnervingly close." While Dreyer's not, from his public literature or social media, a fan of Vladimir Putin or the Russian government, he is Orthodox. And he, along with numerous other American Orthodox converts, anachronistically use the history of Russia-Soviet period as a portend of things to come for the US, unless Christians rise up against the perceived tide of secularism and its Bolshevik-like social justice warriors, who, according to Dreyer, are bringing with them a soft form of totalitarianism that targets thought crimes. And by this, Dreyer means, and he lists in his book, homophobia, transphobia, racism, and ableism. This type of language, us versus them, is not a regurgitation of the paranoia found in American nationalism rhetoric that anthropologists Kathleen Stewart and Susan Harding documented among Christian conservatives in the 1990s, but it builds upon it. It expands it in many respects. The use of language associated with Marxism is not simply a product of Dreyer's interest in the history of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, nor is it about comparative history at all. Rather, Dreyer is reaching into the toolkit of conspiracism and using ideas that were popular in the United States during the Red Scares and the McCarthy era. He also, it seems, leans into the somewhat fashionable trend among far-right conservatives to term liberals Marxist. In doing so, Dreyer employs a cultural Marxism conspiracy theory that the Southern Poverty Law Center has noted is anti-Semitic, xenophobic, and a massive part of the American culture wars rhetoric. Why is this important to note about Dreyer? Because in Orthodox Christian circles in the US, Dreyer appears as an average far-right or ultra-conservative figure. And yet his ideas are seemingly conspiratorial, and his ideas hit home with his followers because they appear to have historically focused apocalyptic theories that possess logic. While classic conspiracism pulls on historical moments and ideas to create its internal logics, new conspiracism, according to Rosenblum and Muirhead, works through the mechanisms of anti-government, outsider rhetoric. And this is perhaps why QAnon works so well with Trump's drain the swamp, they want to get rid of me rhetoric. January 6th was an event that was steeped in the mechanisms of new conspiracism. The persistent wheel of dis and misinformation, often coming from Russia, that cycles through the social media silos and becomes embedded in the vocabularies and actions of consumers. Even after the court cases about election fraud and tampering were thrown out in various states, the MAGA crowd would not rest until their world-building project became reality. One such Orthodox member of that crowd was Father Mark Hodges, and I recently wrote about Hodges and others like him for an article in Religion Dispatches. On December 31st, 2020, Hodges copy and pasted a blog post to his public Facebook feed from Stephen W. Mosier, the president of the Population Research Institute, a conservative think tank that doesn't believe in the idea of overpopulation, questions the roles humans play in climate change, and suggested last fall that the panic over COVID-19 was an attempt to suppress votes for Trump. Hodges' Facebook post was a regurgitation of Mosier's belief, and I'm quoting Mosier here, that Trump is called and America will answer. That post included Mosier's idea for what might take place on January 6th, and this is what Hodges copy and pasted. Quote, "Imagine this, the Senate has retreated to its chambers to consider the official slate of electors from, say, Pennsylvania. As they are about to vote, a chant erupts from the crowd outside, 'Stop the steal, stop the steal.' It's followed by, 'Elections fair and free of fraud.'" Hodges, it seems, did not want to only imagine what that might look like, but be there when it took place. While it seems that Hodges bought into the big lie, at least enough to be in DC on the 6th of January, on the Feast of Theophany, a high holy day in Orthodoxy, other far-right Orthodox Christians often also supported Stop the Steal in a variety of ways through social media platforms. While not present at the Capitol, they seemingly agreed with the election conspiracy theory, praising the patriots who were present and condemning Trump for backing down and asking the mob to go home. and they suggested that this perhaps was the beginning of a new shift in American politics. Diving into the social media worlds of Orthodox Christians can often feel like Alice falling through the looking glass. Converts make up a good deal of English language Orthodox social media traffic on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and they are quite candid about their ideological beliefs. Anthropologist Webb Keen reminds us that ideas, like everything else, circulate insofar as they have some medium. The political ideas that were present in the Appalachian convert community and deployed by Father Mark Hodges are part of the larger circulations of conspiratorial knowledge that have become more present around the world through the processes of digital globalization. Media are mechanisms through which social connectivity becomes easier, with the distance between places like Russia and the United States being covered with a few simple keystrokes. Digital media technologies as a means through which far-right Orthodox communities create and sustain social worlds cannot be underestimated. Technology becomes the link through which they find and spread dis and misinformation, propaganda, conspiracies, all of which are often coded as theology and concerns over spiritual warfare. Many of the posts found on typical far-right Orthodox social media platforms are from the popular website Russian Faith. The site was founded by David Curry, an American who grew up Orthodox, and Charles Bozeman of Russian Insider, a site that runs Nazi sympathy pieces. They founded this together while they were still expats in Russia. The Russian faith description, which was written by Curry, provides insight into how the founders understood their digital platform in light of the digitizing global culture wars. And I'm quoting Curry here. We created this website in August of 2017 to more fully report on major global, cultural, social, and political shifts, which affect not only Russia, but indeed the whole world. The rebirth of Christianity in Russia, the attacks on and the decline of Christian values in Western Europe and America, and the profound subsequent effects in society, culture, and government. End quote. Launched during the same time I was moving to Appalachia, this site sought to promote Orthodox social values while highlighting how modern Russia rejected, quote, the most sacred of modern Western beliefs, the separation of church and state. Articles on the site recently include Dixie and Russia. What do they have in common? Severe consequences for resisting vaccine passports in America, warnings from state health department official. Homosexuals persecute priests suspended for attending January 6th DC rally. Trump supporters seeking Russian citizenship and freedom of speech. And democracy is a fraud. We need monarchy. Many of the articles are written by Americans, including the dissident Mama, an Orthodox convert and podcaster who uses the writings of Holocaust denier and radical far-rightist Boyd Cathy to explain what the South can learn from Russia. Russian faith functions much like most private media clearinghouses, providing articles and information with a specific agenda. In the case of Russian faith, it's almost always propaganda and often conspiratorial. In 2018, Curry, who lived in Russia for quite some time, handed over editorial reins to Bozeman for Russian faith, but stayed on at Russian Insider as an operations director. Curry grew up near a historic Russian Orthodox monastery in upstate New York, and he has deep familial ties to the community in Appalachia. Ideologically, his public views on social media were quite in line with what I've witnessed from other far-right Orthodox digital spaces. Repostings of Ben Shapiro, far-right media outlet, OAN, and reposts from Alex Jones. Through his social media posts and his work both at Russian Faith and Russian Insider, Curry reinforced the dualistic binary of Western secularism and depravity against the salvific forms of Russian Orthodoxy in the Eastern world. In order to give Christianity a voice, Curry's Russian Faith had private funders while also being crowdfunded. The site served as a form of income for American posters who moved to Russia, including Father Joseph Gleason, who rose to fame among convert communities when he moved to Rostov the Great in 2017 with his wife and 8 children. An American convert from Protestantism, Father Joseph was the rector of an Orthodox parish in the Midwest before moving to Russia, a move he made because he was concerned over the influence of homosexuality in the US and because he disagreed with American foreign policies. In the last year, Gleason has published numerous conspiratorial posts on Russian faith, including those that spread misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines, and one or two attacking Black Lives Matters as a Marxist LGBTQ plus terrorist group with links to George Soros. Certainly, the political nature of Russian faith is not limited to Gleason or Curry's influence. Charles Bozeman's role as editor beginning in late 2018 meant that the religiously focused site would become even more sensitive to issues of global politics and infused with right-wing ideologies and conspiracies. In 2019, Bozeman had an interview on the InfoWars set with Alex Jones, while he had a film crew there shooting a documentary about Jones. In the interview, Bozeman talked about living in Russia as a child when his father was the bureau chief for the Associated Press and moving in far-right and alt-right media and social networks during the 2010s. The connections between David Curry, Jones, and Bozeman are not to be overlooked, for each has networks that are deeply entrenched in Putin's government and far-right American conservative communities. Jones and Bozeman were and are fearful that liberal globalists will take down the United States through open borders and progressive politics. They're coming for your children, Jones said of the globalists in the interview, claiming progressive secularism to be a satanic force in world politics. The main issue for both men was freedom of the press, of religion, and above all, the moral family. Freedom is a major trope found in many of the conspiracy theories that are spread between Orthodox Christians in the US and their compatriots in Russia. Believers often fear their religious civil liberties, their freedom to practice, preach, and spread their beliefs will be denied them. Ironically, the political structures of the United States that converts fear might take away their civil liberties, compromise the moral integrity of their children, and perhaps even incarcerate them for their beliefs are in fact the mechanisms through which their freedoms are made possible, even their freedom to read and spread conspiracy theories. Now, at first blush, we might not think of Russian Orthodox religious propaganda about the end of the world, the return of the Tsar, and the importance of Vladimir Putin in the reconstitution of some Christian mythic past as part of conspiratorial language. Yet when converts in Appalachia who readily ingest the contents of Russia Today, Russian Faith, and Russian Insider talk of Putin as an echo of the last Tsar, as someone who seems to be the last true statesman, they align themselves with Putin's autocratic, perhaps even fascist regime that is strengthened politically by propaganda, misinformation, and conspiracy theories disseminated online. When self-identified, red-pilled based radicalized Groyper Orthodox young men on Twitter hold up Russia as an ideal image of a conservative country with a strong moral president, they do so by employing globally circulated memeified conspiracies regarding the deep state, globalism, and liberalism that are rooted in anti-Semitic, anti-American, and anti-democratic ideas. After the news of Hodges' priestly suspension for his January 6th involvement hit the social media scene, young Orthodox men tweeted that this would be the beginning of soft gulags for Christians in the US. They believed that the liberal media and liberal Christians were trying to take down a holy man who had the right to protest and support American freedom. And those who wrote about Hodges, such as myself, were categorized by far-right Orthodox men as Jews, thereby reinforcing the Jewish conspiracy trope that is not only part of the Q movement, but is often used in white nationalism circles and their accompanying radicalized groups. I tend to think of the Orthodox actors who are facilitating this highly religious form of new and classic conspiracism as fostering something we might call trad conspiracism. From my vantage point, this is conspiracism that has both rational and irrational logics that are cloaked in the language of theology and social morality. Now, this is not to say that the actors themselves are irrational. On the contrary, from an anthropological perspective, it's not the actors who are irrational, but the social mechanisms the actors are part of. Those who participate in those social mechanisms are doing so out of a perceived logic that emphasizes the fear of sin or difference and the promotion of religious and social purity. Dreyer's previous book, The Benedict Option, which was on the New York Times bestseller list, focused on Christian communal living and what he saw as an apocalyptic post-Obergefell culture of America. Trad conspiracism ignites these futile fantasies, these unrealities, as Jason Stanley calls them, world building projects of fascism, as I tend to see them, strengthening the growing truth divide in the US through insular mechanisms of partitioning that fearfully focus on difference. Conspiracy theories about the so called homosexual agenda have been on display in Orthodox circles for some time now. I'm reminded of when Father Josiah Trenum, an evangelical convert in the Antiochian Orthodox Church in Southern California, was invited to speak at the World Congress of Families. And this is a group that has ties to Southern nationalists and Russian hate groups. He spoke at the World Congress of Families in Tbilisi, Georgia in 2016. During his speech, he proclaimed, and I'm quoting Trenum here, tell the LGBT tolerance tyrants, this lavender mafia, these homo fascists, these rainbow radicals, that they are not welcome to promote their anti-religious and anti-civilization propaganda in your nations, end quote. Using the language of fascism, Trenum drew on conspiratorial ideologies to reference moral boundary making. Ironically, employing the rhetoric of fascism against liberal populations through public discourse and conservative media outlets, far-right groups strengthen their fascist world-making projects through repetitive panic politics over persecution that often incite phantasmagoric horrors of the other. As conspiracy theories, such as those proclaimed by believers of Q and those embedded into the moral discourses of far-right conservatives, continue to circulate online, causing social action, even violent action, it seems likely that the divisive rhetoric of fascism will only become more pointed and obvious in the US. Fascism's insidiousness comes not only from its ability to draw together groups of people united by an idea that one person or one concept can transform social order and preserve it from external forces, but through its ideological malleability and at the same time, its horrific internal durability. While the power of fascism never fully actualized in the United States the way it did in Europe and elsewhere, it is nevertheless a constant threat to American democracy, especially given its incendiary hybrid formations that have emerged in the 21st century. The splintered nature of fascist groups, Proud Boys, white nationalists, QAnon adherents, and potentially even radicalized converts to Russian Orthodoxy who believe Russia can save the world, mean that they can easily pierce the public discourse in curated and targeted ways through the online circulation of ideas. Fascism is not back, it never left. The Trump era seemingly made fascism publicly allowable, and the internet offered ready digital pathways for its spread. Thus, fascism became fashionable in some respects, as a pejorative in political discourses, and as an ontological framework for some far-right conspiracists and ideologues to understand their place as persecuted patriots in shifting narratives of global freedom, democracy, and political sovereignty. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for that talk. That was really, really interesting, thinking about the transnational perspectives of this conspiracism. Let me, while Sarah takes a breath for just a minute, encourage all of our participants who have questions to use the Q&A feature. I see one question there already, and we'll get to that. Sarah, I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about the particular participants that are drawn into these Eastern Orthodox circles in West Virginia. Did you find that there is a particular age demographic? Is there a particular professional class or blue collar class? Like, who are these people who are being drawn in, and do you have any sense of like what the initial lure is?
That's an excellent question, Terry. And if I had a lot more time, I would have put all of that in the presentation. So a composite sketch of a typical convert to Russian Orthodoxy in the US would be a well-educated white male between the ages of 18 and say 50, married or single. They typically have a bachelor's, but more likely than not, they'll have a master's, even a PhD. They're very well read. And they typically have jobs such as I've encountered doctors, lawyers, nurses, um, some former potential theologians. So they're a very sophisticated group of people. In fact, the group that I worked with was well above the poverty level in
Mm.
terms of class in that area, and that would be the whole of the group. What's interesting is when they found converts from the region, so those who had not moved in to be near this monastery, is the sort of Russian trope as you go out to the country and you live near a monastery. So when they attracted locals who actually lived in the town itself, they had a different class demographic. And there was a very distinct way in which you could feel that shift happening in specifically in the parish. And I will say, Terry, that the community I worked in had a monastery and a parish, which are, it was almost like having two field sites in essence.
Mm. And then, and can I follow up very briefly? And some questions are coming in the Q&A. In my own research in Kentucky and Tennessee, one of the things that I noticed was from evangelicals, there was a real interest in Catholic practices, in the sense that they were returning to some sort of ancient Christianity.
Mhm.
Um, is that, do you think for evangelicals, is that the draw, that this looks like an ancient form of Christianity, and then they kind of get wrapped up in the fascist trad conspiracism? Or is it they're drawn to the conspiracy things and then they adopt the religious practices, or something else?
So I would say it would probably be the first. Most who are interested in Orthodoxy go through this process, the process of conversion, and they search out different churches. So they might go to the Catholic Church, but often they have too much fear of the papacy to sort of step foot. I mean, there's a few. More likely than not, they'll turn to Eastern mysticism, what they see as Eastern mysticism, the sort of neo-colonialist view of Eastern mysticism. Many of them sort of took a sideways approach and went into Islam or Buddhism before they found Orthodoxy. And they believe that that was them being sidetracked by the evil one or the devil before they could find the true faith. But it seems like to me, after living with this group for a year and talking to people who lived there and then left the community as well, um, that the political ideas were never there until about 2016. Something really transformed when Trump went into office, and this community became sort of politically galvanized
Hmm.
to find something else, something beyond American politics.
And so let me, I think one of the questions that might be a nice follow-up is from Jacob. And he says, how does this trad conspiracism, parenthetically, absolutely great term, by the way, how does this trad conspiracism among the Orthodox interact with similar developments in Catholic and Protestant circles?
It's very similar to what we're seeing in Catholic, especially trad Catholic circles and very far right evangelical circles. The difference with this community is that the focus now is all on Russia and on Vladimir Putin, which is, it's different. We see, especially in trad Catholic and evangelical circles, this focus on Trump, right? Like making America great again, restoring the Christian values of America. I think in some sense, Orthodox converts, these far right Orthodox converts at least, again, I don't want to generalize, um, don't even think that there's hope left for the United States. And so Russia becomes sort of this beacon for them. In fact, I didn't talk about this, but there's a massive group on Facebook. I can't remember the title of the group, but it's something like Moving to Russia or Going to Russia. And if you go through it, it's mostly converts who have decided that, America is not great anymore and they need to flee. And Trump's or Putin's Russia looks appealing because it's seemingly religious from the outside, at least.
Hmm. And so Evan has a question that where he says he'd be interested in your thoughts about the role of oil, gas, and coal as forces that shape these transnational religio-fascist associations.
Hmm.
Oil and gas feature centrally in Putin's consolidation of power, and coal is a social force of another kind in Appalachia. These are disparate kinds of economies, of course, but perhaps they play a similar role in different contexts.
Yes, Evan, thank you for that great question. In fact, I was just thinking about this because one of my side projects is looking at the Russian influence in the coal industry in Appalachia, because we know that part of the coal industry was taken over by Russian forces. There's lots of wealth to be had still in Appalachia, and so there's been this really sort of tenuous position that Appalachia has been put in because of Russian outside external Russian forces doing this sort of same extractive neocolonialist practice that have been in place with Appalachia for a long time. So that I can't speak to it yet, but give me a couple of years, Evan, and I'll be able to.
That really is a really interesting kind of connection that I hadn't thought of until Evan uh, popped the question there. But in Appalachia, coal is such a contentious
Yes.
thing, right? That it's a heritage thing. It's what our ancestors did, but with the leveling of mountaintops and other strategies of extracting the coal, it's quite contentious there. Is there some is the economies in the areas in which you study, is it being depleted in a particular kind of way that then certain fascist groups can kind of move in and exploit some of those economic disparities?
Not in the region. The region I was in, it was gone. The coal was gone. I
Mm.
met two miners, one of whom had just transferred over to a steel mill because he was one of the last miners on a mine a few counties over, and it was gone. And the man I rented a house from, his son who looked after the property, he was done. He was looking for work because there was nothing left in terms of coal. What's really interesting is right now there's sort of a revival of socialism at the same time in Appalachia.
Mm.
Socialism was very prevalent in Appalachia, tied to the unions, in fact, historically. And there's been sort of a revival, especially combined with LGBTQ plus initiatives. So at the same time that we see these sort of fascist world making projects, we're also seeing a revival of socialism. And that really tells us something that there are particular parties in Appalachia looking for other political realities beyond what the American government is offering them.
Yeah, so that's a great segue, I think, into the third question that's been posed. How do you think that fascism in America will progress with the election of President Biden? What are your predictions?
Well, I am definitely not an oracle. I would look at the FBI reports, which say it's on the rise, and that hate groups and homegrown terrorism is on the rise. So sadly, I would say that probably it's going to be more prevalent because the truth divide is just growing, and the culture wars are reinvigorating, and the rapid way in which information is spread now through digital networks just makes it so easy.
A good colleague of mine finished his research. I want to say in the early '80s, and his dissertation research in the early '80s. And he said when he published that book, it was something about um, like how to talk in the culture wars, like mediating the culture wars. And he tells me over and over that when he published that book, he thought that the culture wars were over, that no one was ever going to read his book because it was fading out.
Mm.
Um, do you? I think it's an interesting thing to think about the culture wars in America kind of being exploited at this particular moment, and what you refer to as the fashionable aspects of these conspiracies, these track conspiracies. What is it that merges the two? And I'm thinking particularly, do you have like specific instances of the way that religious language is utilized to kind of draw people into some of the conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about when the January 6th events took place, and far right men on Twitter were sort of extremely supportive of what was going on. But it was all sort of wrapped in this language that you wouldn't necessarily read as supportive unless you understood the religious context of it. So Nicolas Fuentes, who we know of far right fame, had posted on Twitter, I think it was right before he was banned from Twitter, that he was going to the January 6th rally, that he was going to be there. And then immediately, one of these far right Orthodox guys retweets it. And then he posts in the name of the czar, which is something, in Orthodox circles, Tsar Nicholas II, the last czar, is considered a saint um, in Russian Orthodox circles. And this group really sees him as the pinnacle of all that was that could be considered a holy and God ordained leader. So he's basically showing support for Nicolas Fuentes and this sort of radical retaking of the capital through hopefully the intervention of the Tsar, who they see as always interceding for them.
Hmm. One of our graduate students posted a question, and Nevada asked, transnational fascism. That's pretty interesting, given that most of the scholarship on fascism presumes this drive to invigorate the nation or reestablish a fictional past. So, assuming that your interlocutors aren't just sort of trading past for place, what do you feel like is going on?
I think they're really quite taken with Russia. Well, the image, let me rephrase that, the image they see of Russia coming through Russian media outlets. And they imagine that somehow through religious revival in the post-Soviet period, that Russia can get back to the pre-revolutionary sort of relationship between church and state that they once had. And if that's the case, that's really appealing to them because their whole goal is to have a monarch again.
In a monarch strictly attached to a conservative, patriarchal
Yes,
church authority.
yes, absolutely.
Hmm. Um, let's see here, I had a question. Oh, I wanted to follow up with this because there's not questions in the Q&A box right now. So let me encourage our participants as well to throw in some more questions. I recently did a podcast where I was interviewing a couple of scholars about apocalyptic tendencies and ideas in the US and how attractive they are. And at separate times, both of these scholars made the point that they thought one of the reasons conspiracy theories were so attractive at this moment was that it was a continuation of kind of biblical apocalyptic play. No, they didn't call it that, but that there's something fun in trying to decode the Bible. And that with these conspiracy theories, I was reading a lot about the conspiracy, particularly QAnon before this,
Mhm.
because I'd only known kind of the generic.
Right.
And one of the things that I discovered was that these anons were posting um, these very ambiguous statements, and then there was like these thousands of people trying to decode what was going on. Do you see that with some of the things that you're studying, or is what you're studying a more kind of emboldened traditionalism that is being kind of very articulate about anti-secularism, anti-particular groups of people in the US? Or is it a mix of conspiracy theories where we're trying to decode certain things at the same time? Does that make sense at all?
Yes, it does. I would say it's very sophisticated. It's really based in Russian theology. What they see is the writings of the Russian monastic elders, about the end of the world. And yet at the same time, I mean, this is where it sort of gets into a blend, but not fully. At the same time, you'll see them sort of hawking these conspiracy theories, but they're in no way like QAnon, what we might call QAnon adherents. They wouldn't call themselves that, but they're circulating those conspiracies, they're just repackaged
Mm.
in a way that seemingly makes sense in Russian Orthodox language. Every form of religion has its own sort of like lexicon, and Russian Orthodoxy has its own way of talking about the world. So when we talk about COVID-19 and the vaccine, the whole 5G microchip thing that's been swirling around, they absolutely talk about that. But it's more about this is how we'll track you for the end times. Potentially mean the rise of the Antichrist. This is why we need a new czar, so they can hold back the Antichrist, right? So it all makes sense to them. They're not really searching for anything because they already know the answers, and the answers are found in their faith. They just see these conspiracy theories as sort of gestures towards the future.
Hmm. And many of us have people within our family or friend networks who have jumped on these conspiracy theory bandwagons via Facebook or other social media sites. One of our attendees asked, "Do you have any advice about how to discuss and debunk conspiracy theories with followers, especially when they are tied uh, with religious identity?"
Oh boy, that is a great question. In fact, I've been receiving a lot of emails recently, not just about conspiracies, but also about how do you talk to people who are very far right, who hold these ideas about others that are just blatantly, misogynistic, blatantly racist. And I don't have the answers. I'm just a social scientist, right? But I think it takes a collective to sit down and figure out, perhaps there needs to be a collective in the Orthodox Church that comes up with a manual for how to deal with this if you see it in your parish. I mean, that would be tremendously helpful, I think, in terms of how do we go about creating, social dialogue where there seems to be no way to do that. And as an anthropologist, I'll say that talking is a really a good way to start. It's not going to fix everything, but at least listening to people and actually hearing them helps.
And so I think a good follow-up question that Anna poses is what has been the response of the Orthodox hierarchy to your research? So I'll stop there first. Have you received any feedback from the Orthodox churches about what you're doing, and whether you have your thumb on the pulse of what's really going on or not?
I've received a lot of feedback. There are a lot of angry members in row 4 who feel like I am um, I am trying to create um, resentment towards Russia.
Mm.
Um, and I mean, there's lots of blog posts about me from Russian Orthodox priests and all of that circulating online. You can just Google me and you'll find them. Um, but it's fascinating to me because I always tell them, and I usually try to email every single one of them back, and I say, these are the words and actions of believers I lived with for a whole year. Any interview that I did was recorded; it was on the record with signed and informed consent. And I did my best to show us the status quo of that community. And whether you like what you see or not or hear, that's what's there, and that's what's happening.
And so in these blog posts, first let me say sorry that you end up being targeted in that way as a researcher, but
Well, I think it highlights, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, Terry, but I
no.
think it highlights why so many people aren't working on the far right now. There's only so many ways you can go about working with the far. You can either do it as someone who shows informant solidarity, and that's usually through embedding yourself and poses some sort of ethical questions because you often have to lie about who you are. That's not something I chose to do. I chose to just listen to people. And what I found really interesting is that my whole year there, no one ever asked me my political views.
Hmm.
I sat at a dining room table on Thanksgiving with a priest, and he talked about Hillary and the election. and the fraud that was going on. And his daughter said, Papa, she may have voted for Hillary. And he laughed. I said, oh, please. And then he just went about eating. And he never asked me, like if he would have asked me, right, the night might have gone differently. We may not have had pumpkin pie and a few more laughs. But I think they just saw me as sort of someone who was there to listen, and I certainly was. In the tradition of excellent anthropologists like Faye Ginsburg, who listened to abortion activists on both sides, in Fargo in the 80s. I was there to listen, and that's a really hard place to be in because the results are often not what they assume they will be. Because when you're just listening, people are often more candid than they assume they are.
So your methodology and I guess positionality of you as a researcher in that context, I think is a really interesting thing to think about. 'Cause we have several grad students I saw on our list of participants.
Mm.
Do you have any recommendations or suggestions for entering into these types of spaces where you, as the researcher, I mean, I know you were talking about that just listening mode, but were there other things that you learned through your processes of research that maybe you could share?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, when I first went into this, my intent was not to work with a far right community. I went there to research the reproduction of iconography, which that community is known for. So I didn't know what I was really stumbling into. And when I went there, nobody wanted to talk about the reproduction of icons, even though I'd made a film there about that. And they wanted to talk about their political ideas. So it was a learning process right from the start of what to do when you find yourself in one of these situations. And the first thing I did is read as much as possible by academics who were doing the same thing.
Hmm.
And sadly, in 2017, 2018, there wasn't as much out there. There's more now, but there wasn't as much then. And I tried to make myself what my advisor always said was a good neighbor. So people needed rides, people needed, food. There I was. I embedded myself as part of the community. I sang in their choir. I worked in their food pantry. I helped out. I did whatever I could to be helpful and to not draw attention to myself. I wanted this to be about them. And I
Hmm.
think that was probably the most helpful bit because then people, once I started interviewing them, it was at least 3 or 4 months into the process, they were much more comfortable with me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was very similar to when I was doing research in a similar kind of area that one, if you can get in, then
Right.
you're in, right? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's a level of trust and
Yeah.
suspicion disarmed there.
And I will say this, on every interview, I asked people the same set of questions because I thought it was important to sort of have that as not only are these quantitative, but they're also sort of qualitative in the sense that they had demographics because ROCOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, is notoriously terrible for keeping statistics about their adherents. And so, if I can do some small part to add to the statistics of how many there are, that helps future researchers. But I asked everyone the same set of questions. I asked them to tell me their conversion narrative. I asked them to tell me their political beliefs. And then I asked them to tell me what they thought about Russia and Vladimir Putin. And so they knew up front what I was going to ask. And often I would give them questions in advance so that there would be no misunderstanding about what I intended to ask them.
Yeah, that sounds like a really, really safe tactic to
Yeah.
provide them. Yeah, yeah.
Once I
So
knew the direction this was going, I wanted to make sure I had all of my, securities in place.
yeah, I think that's probably wise. Presley asked an interesting question about since you studied those who were kind of converting into Eastern Orthodoxy in the area, were you able to to find and interview anyone who had actually left the Eastern Orthodox Church in the area, or maybe even some of the your interlocutors reference those who had left, and
Mm.
how were those people perceived and understood in that context?
So yeah, so people talked a lot about, particularly when monastics left the community, because the brother, it's an all male monastery, and the brotherhood there was very close. And they're mostly, the monastery skews young. So think of young monks, 20s and 30s predominantly. And there were two monks who left that people kept referencing, that it was just sort of heartbreaking, and they missed them. And people cried over it. They were very emotional about these two men who had left. And I waited until actually this last fall to interview both of them, because I wanted to make sure that I knew interviewing them would cause tension. And I wanted to make sure that if I was going to interview them, I needed to already be separated from that community. And that happened.
Okay.
They were very unhappy with what I wrote about them the first time, in the fall of 2019. So they sort of just, dismissed me and wrote a lot of hateful letters and emails, and then that was it. So I felt comfortable interviewing people who had left. Um, and what was really shocking to me is to hear their understanding of the community and how they saw it evolving. Um, it it wasn't as politically charged as it was when I got there. And I've interviewed three people who have left so far, and they said, "Look, you could see the progression, and what you've written is accurate of what the community is like now. But in the earlier years, it wasn't like that, and we don't know what happened to it. And we saw it change, and we felt it change. And for one, it was the reason why he left."
Hmm. And so, and then John Carlson, he asked a question, so I want to get to that. But in thinking about that shift that they're talking about, there was, the way I'm understanding it is that there was an Eastern Orthodox community kind of focused on religiosity,
Sure.
and then
Yeah.
something shifted and it became much more
Hmm.
politically oriented.
Right.
Um, do you have any sense of what that shift was? Like, what was the impetus for, or maybe there's not one single thing, but that hard shift from religious to religio-political?
Hmm. Hmm. I do. I think it's partially the sort of politically charged moment we found ourselves in 2016, when Trump was elected. I think that's a massive part of it. But I also think that um, there were changes in leadership that affected the way in which the community functioned. And those that left the community spoke about the changes and how that affected not only the brotherhood, but the parish. I think we may have lost Terry. So I'm going to look at John's question. So John asks, how do you distinguish fascist, proto-fascist, and other illegitimate discourses from more serious, legitimate discourses, legitimate critiques of liberalism that might fit properly, helpfully within a democratic frame? Perhaps more importantly, are there dangers of using undemocratic labels or categories with certain critics of liberalism, or pushing them even more farther out of the dialogue over what could be worthy issues of engaging? That is a great question, John. And I thought long and hard before I would label this community as potentially fascist. And I say potentially. Um, they line up with the hallmarks of fascism. The world building project that they are creating is, in from my perspective as an anthropologist, seemingly fascist. And I I'm not sure if calling them that will create more chaos, perhaps. But I also think it should be a reality check for them if they think that their ideas are so mainstream, because they're most assuredly not, in the context of the United States. I hope that answers your question, John. John also has another question. What about trad religious folks? I would love to know a little bit more about that question. Um, if you could, if you could expound, John. And while you are expounding on that, I have, let's see, there's another question in the chat. I will say, John, that with your question about trad religious folks, that it I mean, there's a way in which we can understand them as just religiously um, conservative, and at the same time, we have to think about how their actions are also function in the political space of the United States. Uh, for me, when I sat in the house of a man who um, told me how angry he was that he was overlooked as a white male in the United States, how tired he was of the ways his neighborhood was changing and the diversity that his neighborhood was experiencing, and how he had weapons right above us in a weapons safe, and how he was unsure of who he would fight for if there was a war. That's not. I don't think we can just couch that in the language of Christian conservatism or the language of Christian traditionalism. I think it's something far more political and far more sinister. So that leads me to use things that we might think of as political terms a little bit more comfortably with them than I would with other communities, to be sure. I hope that answers your question, Don. Anna writes, I hope it's Anna, it might be Anna. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. What would you like to see from Orthodox leadership? I really think a denouncement of far right movements would be really helpful. Um, I don't know if we'll see that or not. I know in the case of Father Mark Hodges, he was suspended for 3 months, which a lot of people don't think is enough. And I've talked with people who are close to Father Mark Hodges' community, his parish, and he has a lot of radical views about the world, very, very far right, repeatedly posting on his Facebook and other social medias, QAnon conspiracies. So I would hope that they would take his actions a little bit more seriously, because I believe that the Orthodox Church more broadly in the United States is watching that event. And if they don't take it more seriously, it's just sort of a slap on the hand. And I don't think that that's going to be healthy for the organization long term, because there's many more like him. There's many more Orthodox converts who have these views who didn't go to the January 6th Stop the Steal rally, but they still have the same ideas. And they still hold those values, the same sort of values that Father Mark Hodges holds. Let me see if there's any more questions. Jacob asks, what are their relations with and stances on orthodoxies, both in the United States and around the world? I'm assuming Jacob means the community in Appalachia. So the community Appalachia is under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which was not in communion with the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia for quite a long time, and saw itself as sort of holding on to the true faith of Orthodoxy in the United States, preserving it from socialism until Russia was ready and able to receive the light back. When they realized that socialism had ended, they sort of became more outward facing and more engaged with converts. And so we see large communities of Russian Orthodox outside of Russia adherents who are all converts. So in the community I worked in, 90% of the parish were converts, and about 99, it fluctuated, 99, 98% of the monastery were converts as well. All of the clergy in the community were converts. And so I think that that's really telling of what's happening to Orthodoxy in the US in terms of convert makeup. And, it's across the board. There are massive shifts in Orthodoxy. It's quickly changing from an immigrant religion to a religion that's sort of hybrid in its formation. I see that Terry is back online with us. I've been keeping it going, Terry.
I want to apologize. Yeah, thank you so much. Zoom kicked me off and there was nothing I could do. What did I miss? Did I miss all the answers?
I gave as many answers as I could.
And I'm on my phone now, so I gotta navigate some of this at some point. Can you see the Q&A box? Are there more questions to get to?
I don't think there are any more. No, John had a follow up. We've answered a couple more, and it looks like they're all answered. Maybe not.
Great.
Hold on. Let's see.
Um, oh
yeah.
yeah, I just saw something pop up.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering if
Did you get
Pets was not.
to?
Oh, like we have one from Judith Scott. Do you think that the response, I say her name because I know her. Hi, Judith. Do you think that the response from American Orthodox worker community is caught up in reluctance about the discussions of modernism, i.e. homosexuality, racism, gender issues, also St. Moses the Black, African American Orthodox? Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a reluctance in ROCOR to embrace anything that's modern, right? They pride themselves on being traditional. You know, one of the jokes was, so within a 25-mile radius, there was a Greek parish, an Antiochian Orthodox parish, and this Russian Orthodox community. And they prided themselves on not being the modern Orthodox community. They didn't have pews. They held to the old calendar, which is the revised Julian calendar. So they're off of they're not synchronous with our calendar. And those were really points of pride for them because they felt like those showed that they are preserving those aspects of their worship, were preserving the true faith in some sort of crystalline form. So anything that could potentially modernize the church, so pews, for example, right, were a Western innovation that should be shunned because they don't need anything that's modern. And so, just as these sort of material markers of modernism bothered them, so too did discussions of modernism. So when the Greek Archbishop marched with Black Lives Matter in Brooklyn over the summer, oh boy, that was just, that was satanic in the eyes of many ROCOR believers on the internet. That should not have been done to them in their eyes, because they see Black Lives Matter as a Marxist LGBTQ plus terrorist group.
Do you think that's one of the connections between the Catholic evangelical and Orthodox right-winged version, is that they see themselves as preservers of something that is being lost, and therefore they need to assert themselves politically, culturally, in order to, almost on behalf of everyone else, by proxy, so to speak,
Yeah.
that they're doing the work for us in our ignorance that we don't know should be
Yeah.
undertaken now.
Absolutely. They really feel like the Western world has fallen under the delusion of secularism. And in order to right that, they have to be persistent and emboldened in their ideas in order to save the world.
And then one question, if no one else, what is it about Trump and his administration then that then emboldens these preservers?
I think that he provided, they weren't necessarily super eager to be in my community. They weren't necessarily super eager to vote for Trump. Most of them did not vote for Trump. But those that did really felt like he was just one of them, right? Which seems populist at first glance, but it's not, because what they mean by that is that he's not a Democrat, he's not Hillary Clinton, and he's not going to keep them from their ultimate goal, right? Because their ultimate goal is a re-Christianized United States. And Trump's sort of soft spot, what they saw a soft spot for the evangelicals, seemed to perhaps allow that an entry point, right? And Trump is a good con man. And I don't think they necessarily fell prey to that, but I think that they were using it to their advantage. I think they're too smart to fall prey to that.
Yeah. I did see that. No, I think you got to that question. Did you get to that question?
Oh, no, I think this is a new one.
A new one?
Do you think this embedded religious faith with white supremacy, patriarchal homophobia is reaching for a justification for their politics? God is on our side. Yeah, Judith, I've thought a lot about this. I think it's like this sort of symbiotic relationship where they, their politics justifies their faith, and their faith justifies their politics. And then at the same time, there's the language of which I'm sure those who are Orthodox in here will know very well, which is put not your trust in princes and sons of men in whom there is no salvation. So that's the party line, right? Don't trust politicians. Our home is not this world, At the same time, though, they use politics to their advantage and say, hey, this is not right. We need to protest this, but we're only doing so because our moral conscience tells us we should. And this is not the language of orthodoxy historically, which is like a whole nother lecture, right? The Orthodox Church was never caught up in this language of like the traditional family or morality, the way we see it now in the 21st century. It's really a Western sort of a Westernization of orthodoxy. And in Russia, it's a use of language that they've sort of captured from evangelicals in the West.
And to follow up, and maybe this will be our last question, Jeff asked the question, can you comment on the infiltration of these ideologies into the natural health and fitness community and how those communities help it spread?
Jeff, thanks for your question. Okay, so there's one place I can talk about this, which is essential oils. Essential oils are massive among Orthodox women and among a lot of women in conservative communities, because it's an easy way for someone who sees themselves as a homemaker to have money. And they can do it out of the ease and comfort of their own homes, especially if they have a lot of children and they don't have to work outside the home. The QAnon conspiracies that are sort of embedded into these essential oils are aligned with anti-vaxxer rhetoric. So what you'll see is, if you have COVID, here's the essential oils you should be using, right? You shouldn't be taking medication for it. Your body can handle it. Eventually we'll all get herd immunity. And then that goes on. So I've been following these conservative Orthodox women a lot on Instagram. That goes then into, well, should we take the vaccine? Should we not take the vaccine? The vaccine probably has, aborted fetal cells. And then there's the spreading of dis and misinformation through links, right? Well, you should look at this from, I saw this from a Russian Orthodox priest, or somebody in my parish sent me this link. And the sites are always, sort of sketchy. They're never, it's never the CDC. It's never, the World Health Organization. It's usually like, Pravmir, like, right? Or it's like Crunchy Life or something like that, right? That you would assume would have those kind of ideas. So it's definitely there. It takes on a different form. I'm thinking of, this might be what Jeff is thinking about. Recently, there was like the Pastel QAnon article about how QAnon has infiltrated yoga circles. So it's not so blatant as it is in those circles, but it's definitely there.
That's really, really, I like Evan's question about the coal industry, thinking about essential oils and that being an alternative to the science that's out there, so that many of these people can find an alternative space to be in, to the mainstream culture, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think that's, let me check. I don't see any more questions. Sarah, thank you so much for your talk. It was absolutely wonderful, and for entertaining all of the questions over the last 50 minutes or so. We wish you the best in your research as you continue to dive into what has been shown to us over the last few months, really, really relevant material that we should all be paying attention to.
Thank you so much, Terry. Thank you so much to everyone who organized this and attended. It's been a pleasure.